So much media, so little time. Who keeps track of it all? That would be me. This is Bob Andelman, and this is the Mr. Media Interview, recorded live on blogtalkradio.com from the new media and American League Baseball capital of the world, St. Petersburg, Florida. Estonia is not a country that most Americans could find on a map, let alone understand the modern history of its people. But in the history of freedom from tyranny, Estonians are one of the proudest, most accomplished people in the world. This is demonstrated in a new documentary, The Singing Revolution, produced and directed by Jim and Maureen Tusty. Jim Tusty is a dual citizen of the U.S. and Estonia, whose father came here in 1924. Maureen Castle Tusty was raised in upstate New York. She and Jim met in 1986 and created a business partnership that eventually led them to teach budding Estonian filmmakers in 1999 and 2001. The Singing Revolution, the Tusty's first documentary, tells the astounding and hardly known story of the Estonian people who stood up for themselves, armed only with unity, song, and determination. It is, says Jim, the greatest story never told. Listen to this audio from the trailer for The Singing Revolution, then we'll meet the filmmakers.
Extraordinary show of mass defiance in the Baltic region of the Soviet Union.
Whenever you give free speech to people, then things get out of hand.
This singing together, this was our power. If 20,000 people start to sing one song, then you just cannot shut them up. It's impossible.
What role can singing play when a nation is faced with annihilation by its neighbors? Can culture hold a people together? The small country of Estonia has faced these questions.
I think that to have freedom through singing was the most important thing maybe in my life.
This is the story of how culture saved a nation.
Jim and Maureen Tusty, welcome to Mr. Media.
Thank you, Bob.
Hi, Bob. Thanks for having us.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. This is a fascinating piece of work you guys have created. I understand you've got 4 years of your lives invested in this. That's a pretty substantial commitment.
Yes, indeed. It did take 4 years to put the film together.
So let's start at the beginning in terms of people understanding what this is about. What is the Singing Revolution? Most people outside of Estonia really don't have any concept of what this is.
No, in fact, Maureen and I, when we discovered the story and understood it, and we consider ourselves reasonably well-informed, and we knew nothing of it, and checked with all of our friends who knew nothing of it, that was exactly what drove us to make the film. we felt if we don't tell the story, who will? And if not now, when? And what the singing revolution is the extraordinary nonviolent, peaceful path that Estonia took to free itself from the Soviet Union in the late 1980s. And in fact, they played a very critical, though little-known role in the collapse of the Soviet Union. And we've come to characterize it as the story of David beating Goliath without even using a slingshot. And Estonians would defy the Soviets doing things such as having 300,000 people. Now, mind you, this is in a country of 1.4 million. So you have more than 20% of the entire population of the country standing in an open field, singing songs in defiance of Soviet authorities, forbidden songs. And the Soviets, as much as they could put people in jail for all sorts of reasons, just couldn't figure out how to put 300,000 people in jail for singing, and not even with a fist clenched, singing with smiles on their faces. What are you going to arrest them for?
Now, Jim, your heritage is at least half Estonian. To tell the story must have been a matter of some personal pride, and to learn what these people from your father's country had done, it must have been pretty exciting for you.
Well, on an emotional level, that's certainly true. Although I do want to share this with your audience, that my father is what I would call an Ellis Island immigrant. And he came to the States in 1924 as a child. It was really my grandfather who decided to leave Estonia. And they decided to raise myself and my sister in New York City as Americans. My father was not of that generation who considered himself an Estonian American. I'm an American, damn it. And so as a result, I was really not raised. I mean, my father wasn't ashamed of being Estonian, so I was the only kid in grammar school who knew where Estonia was on a map and a little bit about the country. But I was certainly not immersed with Estonian patriotism or Estonian ethnic pride. I was simply raised as an American kid in New York City. But that being said, Maureen and I had a chance to teach filmmaking in Estonia in 1999. We jumped at the chance, and yes, when we learned the story, I have to admit I'm pretty proud of it.
And Maureen, let me ask you, you married into all this. I'm sure in '86 you had no idea that this Estonia thing would take over your life. How do you square becoming so committed and involved in this?
Well, it's funny. I'm asked that by Estonians very often, and I don't even have the heritage. Why are you interested in this story? Because they, in some ways, coming from a small nation, a lot of Estonian people don't realize, they're used to the world not knowing who they are and where they live and not knowing things about the country. But for me, especially as a filmmaker, it's a tremendous opportunity to share a story, this incredible story that people haven't heard about, and the personal connection with Jim and the family, and being able to explore that history. I mean, it's a phenomenal opportunity just to have the opportunity to sit and speak with these people and hear their stories and document them and record them and have them preserved. So, even for Estonians and for all people to not forget this history and see what people are capable of. So from simply a filmmaker's perspective, it was a phenomenal opportunity that I couldn't have asked for more.
Do you think you guys would have made the same 4-year commitment if this had been, the singing, the dancing revolution in Belarus or something like that? Or
absolutely, Bob. Sorry to jump on that one, but
sure.
Yeah, no, there's no doubt we learned about the story because of my heritage, and without that, we probably would have never heard of it. But that being said, it was never made out of ethnic pride or as an Estonian patriotic act. It was made because Maureen and I are storytellers, and while this is our first feature film, in fact, we've done television documentaries before. We've done mainly television and TV commercials, so we're storytellers by trade. And we just saw right here's a natural story that's hard to blow. You can't mess this one up, kind of, because it's such a fabulous, great story. And to me, anyway, I think for both of us, it's the ultimate story of man's indomitable drive for self-control over his and her own lives. And it transcends Estonia. But I think part of the reason it's so effective in that regard is that Estonia is such a small country, you can kind of get your head around it. If this was a story about 100 million people, I'm sure the story would get more complex, the geography wider. But here you have such a small, contained human story that you could really encapsulate an entire nation's 50-year history in 90 minutes. And the second reason I think audiences tend to relate to it is they come in with no preconceived notions. So if we would do a film on the singing revolution in China or the singing revolution in France, the audience would come in with preconceived notions about what France is and who the French are, who the Chinese are. I think most of the audience come in having no idea who the Estonians are, and where that worked to our advantage, I believe, is they came in with an open mind and were truly willing to absorb the story for what it is. So, yes, indeed, if I found the story anywhere on the planet, I would do it.
It is a story that seems like it could be told from almost anywhere on the planet, because you look at these people. If you're white and Western, you look at the people in this film and you think, okay, I know those people. They could be anywhere. It is a pretty common denominator, I think. So one of the lines that you guys use to promote this is you say this is a story of how culture saved a nation. How does singing change the course of human events?
I think the singing component to this gave these people a foundation and something to ground themselves in. And throughout the course of a very brutal 50-year occupation, singing was a way of maintaining a sense of your family and your culture and literally of your own language. I mean, the Estonian culture was being wiped out in schools. You couldn't speak Estonian. Everything was being switched to Russian. And so to be able to maintain some sense of this culture was tremendously important for maintaining some sense of we are Estonians and we have been here on this land for nearly 5,000 years and if not longer. So it's very core to their hearts and to who their identity is, but also it was a very intentional protest tool. There's a song festival every 5 years with 30,000 singers on stage, 100,000 people in the audience. It still continues today, and that originally started as a means of protest and as a means of peaceful protest. And even throughout the Soviet occupation, as much as the Soviets tried to wipe out that sense of history, of Estonian history, they couldn't they couldn't stop the song festival. So they tried to co-op it. They made it 2 days of singing songs about Lenin and Marx and mostly sung in Russian. But the Estonians worked it that they could keep 2 or 3 traditional songs in Estonian at the end. And so we would ask friends, why would you go and sing 2 days of all these songs that you so hated? And they said it was worth it. It was worth it to sing this crap for 2 days just to be able to have, that's a favorite word over there, but just to be able to have this opportunity to have that sense of being Estonian and being all together and singing our traditional songs. So they would put up with so much just to have that sense of community again. And that really, I think, sustained them in a way throughout. And then when they had the opportunity to flex their protest muscles a little bit more in the late 80s, as Gorbachev came in, it was a very natural outlet, a way of getting tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people together. And you could, think of all the pent-up anger and frustration after your grandparents had been killed and maybe your parents sent to Siberia. And there isn't a person in Estonia who hasn't lost family members throughout this occupation. So you have all of this anger, but yet when you come together and you're singing traditional songs, there's a certain release there, and they were able to keep it nonviolent, which certainly the Soviets were there. They tried to provoke, people, and over the course of 4 years, they never once lost it.
Oh, and I think it's important. It's important background, perhaps, for your audience to know that there was a cultural genocide going on, and I think it's important to understand the importance of the singing. And the cultural genocide was quite direct and specific under Stalin. Got a little bit more unintentional, you might say, as years went on. But between execution of Estonians combined with the importation of hundreds of thousands of Russian workers, there's no doubt that Stalin's specific plan was to eliminate the people, the Estonian people. But indeed, Estonians had to speak Russian. They could not show the national colors. There was absolutely an intent at least to wipe out the Estonian culture. So preserving the language and preserving the music became the weapons of choice for maintaining the nation, even under Stalin, during the entire occupation. So I just want your audience to understand the depth of importance of this music, that even when it was not being used for protest, it was being used as a means of saying we still exist.
I want to say, if you've got a comment or question for documentary filmmakers Jim and Maureen Tusty, producers of The Singing Revolution, give us a call, 646-595-3135, but only if you're listening live. We actually have a call, I think. The system's been a little goofy lately. Hi, do you have a comment or question for Jim and Maureen?
Yes, I wanted to know how did the Estonian people respond to the movie?
Yeah, we were very concerned about that because the obvious possibility was Estonians could feel, who are you from 5,000 miles away to tell us our history? And Maureen and I were concerned about that. And certainly in the course of making the film, we were extremely meticulous in just trying to make sure that we got all of our facts straight. But the reception in general was, and of course I can't generalize even on a country as small as 1.4 million people because there are 1.4 million opinions, but in general the response we got was, this history is current events for us. It's close. As a matter of fact, many of the people we feature in the film are now in Estonian politics and have all sorts of, shall we say, images to protect or resurrect as the case may be. And the feeling was not that Maureen and I are objective, because I don't think anyone can be objective in a certain way, but at least we were coming from an arm's length. So we were coming from a first notion to look at this situation and evaluate it. And I'll close by saying there were three different movements that we highlight. The independence movement wasn't unified. Many Estonians had many different ideas as to how to achieve freedom. And in fact, those three movements didn't get along. There were tensions between them, heavy tensions, so heavy that to this day some of the leaders will not speak to one another, going back to stuff that happened in the 80s. And we were told by many Estonians it was the first film they had seen where they felt all three parties were represented fairly. That traditionally, whoever made the film tended to be, in one camp or another and would tell the film from that viewpoint only. So the reception was quite extraordinary. And lastly, I'll just say when we premiered it at the Black Knight Film Festival in December of 2006, it got a 15-minute standing ovation at the end. And the reason I know the length of the standing ovation is our credits are 7 minutes alone. So they started applauding when the credits came up and kept on going after that. So it was very, very touching.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
Thank you for the call. And I believe we have another call. Hi. Do you have a comment or question for Jim and Maureen?
Yes, I was wondering why they used song for the revolution and why this is so important to the Estonian people.
Estonians have one of the largest collections of folk songs in the world. As Maureen said earlier, they've been on their land for a minimum of 5,000 years, and some anthropologists say 8,000 to 10,000 years. And that makes Estonia one of the longest occupied ethnicities on a certain land in the world. And music has always been part of that culture. And Estonians have been. There are rumors that when the Teutonic Knights invaded Estonia in the 13th century, they were singing protest songs against them. Peter the Great invaded them in the 18th century. They were singing songs in protest of them. So it is just part of the Estonian culture. As Maureen said, this song festival that happens every 5 years has 30,000 people singing on stage. And my favorite point to make about that is they have to audition. It's not any 30,000 singers. It's the best 30,000 singers. And it's flawless singing for 2 days. So it's just what baseball is to America, singing is to Estonians. Not everyone plays baseball. Not everyone even likes it in the States, but it nonetheless is a national pastime.
Thanks very much.
Yep. Thanks
for the call. I have to ask, not to make light at all, but as singing is so popular in Estonia, do they have an American Idol type television competition?
They don't have. I don't think they have American Idol specifically, but I know they participate in Eurovision, which is a huge band contest and a few other things. But it's and it's just so ingrained. It's kind of trickles through everywhere in the culture. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, if any of your listeners, go ahead.
No, please, Jim, go ahead.
Yeah. If any of your listeners are interested in the Song Festival, I will just tell your audience that it plays every 5 years, and this is the year. It is, I believe it's July 2nd through 4th. It's always the first weekend in July. In 2009, people can go to Tallinn and hear these 30,000 people on stage. Maureen and I have done it twice. I don't know how to describe it. I mean, it takes 15 minutes for people to get up on stage. It's half of Yankee Stadium during the World Series singing in perfect harmony. Don't know how to describe it, but it's just a fantastic, fantastic thing. But my caution to your audience, if anyone does want to go there, tickets to the event is not the problem. It's an outdoor arena. You can always get tickets. The issue is hotel rooms. Estonia only has so many hotel rooms. If you don't get these hotel rooms quick, you got to sleep in Helsinki and take a ferry over.
Aren't there any old tanks lying around people could sleep in?
Possibly, if you can find them. Sure.
Yeah, the Estonians have done a remarkable job of transforming the country since the Soviets have left and since '91, and you wouldn't even recognize it. It's a beautifully restored country, and Old Town and the main cities are just gorgeous, and it's quite a thriving, exciting place to be these days.
Wow. Well, we've got another call for you. Hi, do you have a comment or let's see if the line's going to come up. Wait a minute. Hi, do you have a comment or question for Jim and Maureen?
Hi, I was wondering if they could talk a little bit about the logistics of shooting a documentary in a former Soviet republic. Were there any obstacles that were in their way, either government bureaucracy or the technology or the infrastructure of the country itself? I was just wondering if they could talk about the process, actually, since it was such a large commitment on their part, 4 years.
Sure. Well, we never intended it to be 4 years, and certainly our original plan was, well, a year and a half, 2 years, and we'll belt this out. But one of the main hang-ups was raising money to keep it going, and then obviously the travel back and forth. I think we were fortunate that Estonia had progressed enough since the collapse of the Soviet Union, since '91, since regaining their freedom, that by the time we were filming, they are a pretty technically savvy country. But there's still some aspect of old school and new school. So a little bit of bureaucracy, but it wasn't primitive in any way. So the main thing was, dealing with different systems, and it's a smaller country, so you didn't have as much equipment to choose from and flying things over and logistics like that. I think the biggest challenge is language, and neither Jim or I speak Estonian, and dealing with translations and accuracy and just truly making sure that we were comprehending what the person was saying and what they intended. And then as we were in the production process, when we did have to have subtitles for the few interviews that were in Estonian and not in English, just making sure we had tremendous accuracy in what was being said, and just making sure that came across in the film, and a lot of double checking. So that's certainly a little bit of a hang-up, but again, Estonia is, these days, it's almost, I'd compare it to traveling in Scandinavia, where very many people have English as a second language, so it makes it quite easy for us to do work over there, fortunately.
But I also want to paint another picture. Not only do we not run into too much post-Soviet bureaucracy, because after all, this was 13 years after independence, and I'm sure the first 5 years is a different story, but by 13 years after, let me explain something about Estonia. They're way ahead of the entire world in e-business, and by that I mean they had the first presidential elections by computer. For the next presidential elections, they figured out ways where people can vote by cell phone. Their parliament meets virtually. It meets by computer with video cameras, and the most amazing little touch I can tell you is Estonian parking meters are paid with your cell phone. I don't even know how that system works, but they park your car, they type some number into the cell phone, and the parking fee comes on your phone bill. So I want to make sure we paint a picture of this is a highly advanced European nation at this point, and part of the reason they could advance so quickly was the Estonian DNA brethren are the Finns. The Finns and the Estonians are very similar, and the language is very similar, like you might compare Spanish to Italian, where they're different languages, but the people can understand one another. And for the entire occupation, the Estonians could always watch Finnish television. And so what happened is not only were they independent in 1939 before Stalin came in, but during the entire occupation, they're watching Western TV shows. They're watching I Love Lucy and Dallas and pick your decade for what show you want. They were seeing it. So when independence happened, they had seen the TV commercials. They had seen the Western lifestyle. They understood it, and they just broke out of the starting gate. In fact, Estonia had the fastest-growing economy in the entire Western world. As a matter of fact, the entire world, aside from, I think, Hong Kong and Malaysia, in the mid to late 90s and even into the early 21st century. So it was, as Maureen said, there's a little bit of old school, new school mentality to a certain extent, depending upon someone's age. But even that was pretty much not a problem.
Did that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. I absolutely love the film.
Thank you.
Thanks for calling in.
Thanks for having me. All
right. Well, that frees up the phone line if you'd like to get your question in. Number is, oh my God, I actually drew a blank on the phone number. It's 646-595-3135. Speaking of doing a film in Estonia, how difficult is it to get there? You mentioned there's not a lot of hotels. How simple or complicated is it to fly to Estonia these days?
Well, depending upon where you're flying from, I would say there are probably a dozen cities that have nonstop flights into Tallinn, the capital. So generally speaking, unless you're from a fairly close European city, well, even Paris, London, any of the major European cities will fly direct. But if you come from the States, I would say there are no direct flights. The most common way to fly is through either Helsinki or Stockholm. Estonia is a Nordic country, really, and they're very close to Sweden and Norway.
One of the greatest moments in the film, I think, anyway, I mean, there's a lot of really defining moments, but is when the Estonians fear that they're about to be invaded, and the big fear, and this is the difference between today and 50 years ago, I guess, they want to protect the broadcast tower. Can one of you tell that story a little bit and how that resolved itself? It's just an amazing tale.
In August of 1991, the coup happens in Moscow, and the hardline communists want to get Gorbachev out of there and crack down and pull the Soviet Union back together. The Estonians, who had been, a huge part of the troublemakers leading to this collapse and instigating this crackdown in a way, and the Baltics were one of the primary reasons that the hardliners wanted to have this crackdown on what was going on there. So, it's as late as 1991, and people had been killed in Latvia and Lithuania, which are neighboring countries also occupied by the Soviets. The Estonians naturally thought they were next. They've been pushing the limits. Things seem to be loosening up a little bit. Suddenly you have this coup, and more tanks are coming across the border to reinforce the tanks that are already there. So there were several days of this incredible tension of what do we do, what's going to happen. So the political leaders who were leading this revolution in a way came together, and the different factions all came together, and they decided this is the time to vote to reestablish our independence, and we all have to vote together to show a unified front. So in the midst of all this chaos, the hardliners have come in, and they say to the world, we are, reestablishing ourselves as independent Estonia, our rightful legal country. But the tanks are still sitting there. No one knows what the reaction is. If the coup succeeds, if the hardliners come back into power, absolutely the cattle cars, the trains were lined up again. The handcuffs were being shipped in. The list of names of all the political leaders were known of who was going to be ousted and arrested and most likely, killed or sent away for all the activities they had been doing the past 4 years. So it was a very, very tense time. And then what happened was the average people, the citizens, they didn't have their own military. They didn't really have their own police. So average citizens came out and they protected the communication centers, the TV tower and the radio station. And they stood in front of the station, arms linked. They had no weapons. Occasionally, a few guys told us how they would wear their hockey helmets, just because in case they got hit over the head and trying to just not get hurt. But they would stand arm in arm in front, blocking the tanks so they could not access and shut down and take over the communication, because they felt at least if we can maintain communication with the Western world, let them know what's going on here and not lose that connection, that's the most critical thing for the world knowing what's going on and hearing us.
Two of my favorite stories did not make the film about this very episode, and actually I think it's the first time we shared this story. Here are two exclusives. One woman told this great story of how her grandmother in her 70s, who was alive during the independence years before Stalin came in 1940, she wanted to help defend TV tower. And this woman told the story of grandmother put on her best Sunday outfit, went into the bathroom, put on the lipstick, did her hair, put on her hat, and walked out with her handbag to defend the TV tower. So this was not just 22-year-old guys being tough. This was the entire nation. The other story that I think just sort of shows how revolutions happen and the kind of events that cause them to succeed, and this story was just too long to put into the film, but briefly it goes this way, that the Soviet soldiers eventually did surround the TV tower, and without getting into too many details, suffice it to say there were two policemen defending the 22nd floor, which housed the electronic equipment that permitted the broadcast. But this engineer on the floor told the story to us of, well, the soldiers started to loot. He said because the Soviet soldiers were very young guys with nothing, and they would just methodically go around first floor, second floor, third floor, taking pens and notepads, taking whatever they could take. He said on the 21st floor was a restaurant, and in the restaurant he knew was a room full of vodka in cases. And this guy said to himself, 100 soldiers, 3 tanks, and a room full of vodka is a bad formula. I don't like the sound of it. And he was thinking, how can I stop this? They're eventually going to get to the vodka. Well, the guy at the time was like 45 years old. He had spent time in the Soviet army, so he knew the Soviet culture, turned to these 19-year-old soldiers on the second or third floor and yelled at them in Russian. I don't speak Russian, but said some equivalent of, you there, stop, attention, standard attention, stop that looting, go back to the ground floor immediately. And they all went. And they listened to this civilian, and I'm sure that every revolution has behind-the-scene heroes like that who are not the guys in the front line but doing amazingly brave and interesting things.
Mm. Well, and you mentioned that what I was thinking of was the two young policemen who stood, I guess, were at the top of the tower the whole time, and at one point were threatening to release Freon into the tower if the Russian soldiers did storm it and threatened to take it. That they were willing to kill them, and that was, stop me if I'm getting the story wrong.
No, you have it totally right. And let me fill in what we couldn't put into the film. These were two guys with pistols facing down 100 soldiers and 3 tanks. And what he shared with us is they had 2 basic strategies. Strategy 1 is he knew they wouldn't blow up the tower because they wanted to use the tower. They didn't want to just shut down Estonian television. They wanted to broadcast from Moscow. Mm. So phase 1, there was a face down. And again, when you're doing a 90-minute film, you just have to shave things 30 seconds a minute at a time. So what's not in the film is that one of the early confrontations was the Soviet commander calls up to them on the tower. There were cell phones in those days. It's 1991. He says, you guys come out or we're going to blow you up. And he turns the 3 tank guns aiming right at the tower. He says, you don't come down in a minute or 2, we're firing. And they said, go ahead. And they did. They called that one right. And then the second point, which you bring up, which is quite accurate, they had a bluff of saying, we'll turn on the fire extinguishing system, which in the Soviet days was a Freon system that sucked oxygen out of the air. And the point is, once the oxygen is sucked out of the air, anyone in the tower dies. And so when they threatened to finally break down the door and come in, they said, we're going to release the Freon gas, and everyone in here will die. And that was a true statement, but where that's a bluff is so were the 2 soldiers. So arguably what the Soviets could have done, I suppose, is break down the door, maybe sacrifice a soldier or 2, but have taken over the tower. It's quite dramatic. And when Maureen and I first met one of the young policemen who defended the tower, we were just blown away at the heroism and the bravery, because really he had to choose what to do. It wasn't clear who was going to win this coup, and he just decided he was willing to die for his nation. Sort of an individual decision he made. We're quite admirable traits.
Well, Maureen, earlier you made reference to Mikhail Gorbachev, and I'm very curious about this. In retrospect, his part, is he seen by the Estonians as a hero or a goat in terms of his part in their eventual freedom?
Well, certainly we have spoken with many people about this topic, and I think I would say the Estonian perspective of Gorbachev is quite different from what people might call the American perspective. I think America does see Gorbachev as a little bit more of the great reformer that came in and opened things up and opened this door. I think when it's looked at in a little more detail and you get into the nuance of what was going on, that our opinion is he had no intention of breaking up the Soviet Union, and he was struggling to keep this together. And the only way he could see keeping it together was reforming. And Glasnost, Perestroika were all about reforming, and it really became an opportunity for the Estonians saw to run with it and push the limits of the system. So it was really, over the course of 4 years, it was a step-by-step process, but it was pushing the limits from multiple fronts. So you had people coming out. You had the mass support of the Estonian population. You had 100,000 people showing up at these events, and some of these were, unorganized events. They would start from a rock concert, and then more people would come, and more people would come, and they were completely spontaneous. You had other rallies that were organized, but you'd get away with the first one and say, okay, we got away with that. No one really got arrested. No one, they didn't release the dogs. Okay, well, what do we do next? And then you had people pushing the system in Moscow. Let's change a few laws. Let's make the hammer and sickle flag illegal in Estonia. Can we get away with that? Gorbachev cracked down on a lot of these things, hated them. A lot of them they were, couldn't get away with, but they were pushing the system from all levels. And it was, we got away with this. Okay, what can we do next? What can we do next? And they never knew the point at which they would push it too far and there would be a military crackdown and lives would be truly at risk. And so, it's all tied in, obviously, with the overall collapse, the economic collapse of the Soviet Union that was going on. But when you're there and you're living in it, and you've been living in this, amazing isolation and control for 50 years, and then to really be able to take the step and to show up at the rally, and especially in the first early years when you didn't know what the police were going to do and what the repercussions were going to be. And, maybe you wouldn't be killed at a rally, but would you lose your next job the next day because you showed up at it? And then the political leaders, how far can we push the system? Can we keep Gorbachev, thinking that everything, we've got it under control here. Don't worry. We're just implementing your plans. Don't worry what's going on here. But really, they were pushing the system to the brink, and they got away with it. But they didn't know, and then it all comes to a head in 1999 with the military coup. So, as much as maybe there were little moments of feeling like, eventually maybe someday we can loosen things up here, but people really didn't know what the final outcome was going to be until they were pushed to making its choice and take a stand, and they did it.
It was interesting. Go ahead.
Sorry, the overall view I would characterize as this. Estonians are grateful Gorbachev came into power because without him coming into power, they could not have launched this singing revolution. That being said, they feel that they achieved their freedom in the face of what he intended, and it's the last thing he wanted, and he was fighting every bit of the way. So in that sense, he was a goat within his own system, you might say. He's a goat for what he was trying to achieve. But in a way, the Estonians appreciate the fact that he opened the door that they could crash open and run through.
But he, I thought it was interesting to learn from the film that Gorbachev put in charge of Estonia an Estonian, a boyhood friend of his, right? Veino Valyez, I think.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's it. Go ahead.
And part of that was he was in a way that was not to keep using this term, but the new school Gorbachev coming in and the old hardliner communists. And so in Estonia there was an ethnic Russian old school communist leader who didn't like what Gorbachev was doing and didn't know how to handle it, didn't know how to implement it. And Vaino Valyez was an Estonian, but he was within the communist system, and he was a politician, and he was a teenage friend even of Gorbachev. And so Gorbachev asked him to take this position and kind of gave him no choice. And it's interesting. It's kind of a controversial view of him because on the one hand, the Estonians will say, well, he was, a communist and he was put in to implement Gorbachev's plans. And yet on the other hand, he did some very dramatic things to kind of keep Moscow feeling everything's okay. Don't worry about what's going on here. We've got it under control. And played a very big role, I think, in kind of appeasing Moscow and letting the Estonians get away with a lot of these activities and push the limits. And he was an incredible buffer. So he played a very unique, very important role in all of this negotiations going on.
It's good to have friends in high places. Now, what about Boris Yeltsin when he followed Gorbachev? Was he thought of any better?
First of all, regardless of what he evolved into, regardless of what issues may have happened later, from the Estonian viewpoint, there's no doubt, Boris Yeltsin wanted independence and freedom for all the Soviet states. Mikhail Gorbachev, you asked what the Estonians thought. I'll boldly share with you what Jim thinks. And what I think really is the key to understanding Mikhail Gorbachev is that he graduated college when Stalin was still in power. So his entire childhood education, grammar school, high school, and college, and maybe he spent 1 year postgraduate after Stalin died in '53, was a Stalinist education. I personally think it's hard to shake that. Gorbachev believed in communism almost in what I would call a very pure and good sense. He honestly believed in his heart that it was the system that any intelligent person, if they sat down and thought it out long enough, they would come to the conclusion this is the way mankind should live. So part of the demon he was battling is he couldn't comprehend Baltic nationalism. He couldn't comprehend that Estonians would feel their ethnic identity was more important than the system of communism. He couldn't even comprehend it, and that's why he got kind of blindsided by it, in my opinion. So I think his intentions were quite honorable. That being said, he was still arresting political prisoners, sending people to prison camps, maybe not as much as Brezhnev, much less Stalin, but he was still a believer in totalitarian rule, and things just got out of hand. And I think his biggest miscalculation, as was pointed out by Savine Ellis in the film, his biggest miscalculation was free speech. Because what he really wanted with Glasnost and Perestroika was free speech about the economic system. Let's talk about how to get the economic system going. And he miscalculated that people would take free speech into this political sphere. No, let's talk about politics. And that was just ridiculous.
Okay. Well, Jim, Maureen, we've got another call here. Hi, do you have a question for our guests about the singing revolution?
Yeah, actually, no, this is fantastic. It's the first time I'm hearing about it and listening in. It's great hearing, all of the things that you've been working on and things that you've done. Here's the question. Where can I get the film?
Thank you for asking. Because
Singing Revolution.
I've done interviews and forgotten to mention the website, but singingrevolution.com is the website. You can learn more. You can watch the trailer. You can watch clips, and the web store is there as well. It's out on DVD. The film was in theaters for the past year. It opened a year ago in December in L.A. and New York, and based on being held over for 5 weeks in New York City, we went from city to city throughout the U.S. and Canada, and we've now played in about 140 different theaters around the country and in North America. So there are still screenings happening in some theaters and film festivals. Those are listed on the website as well. But the DVD has just been released, and we're getting that out there. And after that, we move on to television.
Wow, that's fantastic! Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for calling.
To build on that, if I may, on singrevolution.com, we're also trying to build a community of people who want to understand nonviolent revolution on our blog. And we welcome people coming in and joining the blog and making their comments. And we're starting to research and observe different nonviolent movements in the Mideast, for example. Interestingly enough, two of the first overseas territories to take the Singing Revolution film were Al Jazeera Network and Israeli television. And so we're very passionate about trying to get people to understand this nonviolent revolution, which was strategic in its makeup, is the important thing to understand. It wasn't a question of not being violent simply for the philosophical purity of it. It was a question of, okay, we're not going to kill, but how can we still advance our cause? How can we still have an effective revolution where we win the battle without killing people? And that's the masterful stroke of the Estonians. On our website is also what's called a collector's edition disc. And for those who want to get fanatical about it, we have 4 hours of additional interviews. We have printed documents. We have maps. We have all sorts of stuff about this amazing story. And one that I think is kind of funny is in the additional discs of stories like the Shakespearean play Hamlet was used as a revolutionary tool in the 70s in Estonia. And the story goes like this, that they recognized even the Soviets could not outlaw or censor Shakespeare, for God's sake. You got to use Shakespeare. So the Estonians had a secret interpretation of Hamlet. And for those of you who may remember it from high school, Hamlet opens in the dark with all these people furtively hiding behind pillars and whispering to one another. And that was taken to mean the KGB. That's the KGB hiding behind pillars and whispering to one another, watching our every move. And when Hamlet says something is rotten in the state of Denmark, they're thinking something is rotten in the state of Estonia, and so on and so forth. And there was an official interpretation among the people that Hamlet was all about the liberation of Estonia, and it became the most popular play for high schools to perform. And everyone in the audience knew what it meant, and the Soviets didn't.
That's great. We've got another call for you. Hi, do you have a comment or a question? Oh, boy, this phone system today. Wait a minute. It's not. Try it one more time. Hi, do you have a comment or question for Jim and Maureen? All right, I'm going to apologize to the caller and ask you to call back in. I think you're calling in on Skype or an internet service. For some reason, we can't get you on the air. Hang up. I'm going to hang up and encourage you to call back in, and I'll take your call as soon as we get it. So on the more practical side of things, Jim and Maureen, let me ask you this. In terms of your partnership, who takes out the trash? Who does the cooking? Who's the director? Who's the producer?
Well, interesting. Jim and I have worked together within our company for many years, but we were always on separate projects. Jim was running the company in developments, and other projects would come in. I'd be off producing them. So we used to say the only thing that saved our marriage was the fact that we were in the same company. So at least occasionally, we'd see each other at a staff meeting and know what was going on. But the Sing Revolution is the first project we've ever truly worked on together as co-producer, co-directors. And I'd say it really is a genuine co-production, and we also had a phenomenal editor and co-director on the project, Mike Majoros, and he brought a tremendous amount. So, in the editing room, it was definitely a threesome working on this project. But Jim, I would say, certainly takes a lead more on the development and figuring out the deals on how to get this done. And if I take a lead on anything, it's probably a little bit more the logistics and the directing side of things. But I would say overall it is pretty 50-50. And we won't talk about the home garbage, because along the way, in the course of this 4 years, we had our first child too. So we have a 3-year-old daughter now. So it just she sat in many an edit room, and just recently she had her 3rd trip to Estonia. So she's been around.
Wow.
Maureen and I were concerned about, we'll affect the marriage. I did wonder. There are a lot of sisters that can't work together. And I have to say, it's really fabulous. I want to do it again and again and again. Not only is our relationship great, but we work well together. We have complementary skills. So I myself found I became a better person. And to her point about Mike Majoris, the editor, it was great in the edit room because with 3 people you could not have a tie vote. And it really was either all over the place. Sometimes the guys would gang up on the girl, and sometimes the husband-wife team would gang up on Mike, and sometimes Mike and Maureen made a bad decision. No, that's how it went.
Interesting. Excuse me. So let me ask you this: Is modern Estonia, this country that has survived Stalin twice, Hitler once, Gorbachev, is modern Estonia the way its freedom fighters imagined it would turn out?
I'm curious what Maureen thinks about that, but I think it for the most part, yes. And I think at the same time, freedom is a struggle. I mean, independence and suddenly being responsible for all the actions you take is difficult, and Estonia too now faces economic crisis. That the world has faced for them. It's like time, really, since the Soviet years. So they're struggling with, well, what do we do? Should we have a stimulus package? Could we leave it laissez-faire? What do we do? They don't have decades of experience to grow. So in that sense, I think it's a little bit challenging. But I think it's almost ludicrous to say, and it's a start. Everyone's extremely happy with the result and happy that the freedom to live the lives that you want. The economic personal situation is so much better than it ever was in the Soviet years. But, who can predict the future? Sorry, that's a bit rambling. Maureen, how would you answer that?
Well, I would never want to speak for these amazing people who put themselves out there in a way that I can barely imagine. So, but I do think what has been said to us very often is already the younger generation within Estonia, they're distributing this film in schools, even though it's English based and made by 2 Americans, because people feel it's important that even within Estonia to remember their own history and how quickly it's like our experience of just friends, and they have their children. It's like you want to focus on the future, you want to look forward, you want to build the economy, build this country, and you want success, and you want your children to have that better life than you had, and that's a very human, very natural goal. But what the flip side of that is you're not talking about the past. And I do think, Estonians do have a tendency, to generalize, to be very reserved, and they don't necessarily share a lot of the deeply emotional personal stories, obviously who sits around on a day-to-day basis talking about painful history of their past and their family. And so it's been said it is important to remember. It's like you can't forget. And they also still live with this huge nation as their neighbor that is still trying to, assert influence over them. And, certainly Estonia is a country in and of its own right. It's part of NATO and EU now, but they have a very powerful neighbor that is there. And it's just important to remember how incredibly natural and human and important freedom is.
Well, folks, listen, as I mentioned before, you can order Jim and Maureen Tusty's DVD, The Singing Revolution, at their website, singingrevolution.com. There's also a book, which I had in front of me a moment ago. Here it is, The Singing Revolution. It's by a former National Geographic staffer. Is it Preet Vissaland?
Preet
Vissaland. All right. I imagine that's available at the website also. And you can also order the DVD at Amazon.com or at MRmedia, MrMedia.com. And it's a fascinating film. I really would recommend it to people. As a matter of fact, I'm going to pass my copy on to my daughter's middle school social studies teacher, and hope he'll take an interest in it. Jim, Maureen, thank you so much for being on Mr. Media today.
No, thanks for having us, Bob. Really appreciate it.
No, a tremendous amount of time, and thanks for letting us. We'll talk forever on this subject, so we appreciate it.
My pleasure. Good luck to you both.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye. And folks, for more great indie and documentary filmmaker interviews, surf over to our main website, www.mrmedia.com. That's where you can listen to my earlier conversations with the directors of Steam, Juno, Anita O'Day, The Life of a Jazz Singer, Hamburger America, Little Chicago, In Search of Kennedy, Revolution, Election, Broken, In the Shadow of the Moon, and many more. Please think about writing an online review of Mr. Media, casting a vote for Mr. Media, or marking Mr. Media as one of your favorites, whether you listen on Blog Talk Radio, Pointer Online, Digital Journal, Podcast Pickle, Vox, Folio, Mediafly, Podfeed.net, Blueberry, Zencast, or Odeo. Subscribe to Mr. Media on iTunes, and you'll never miss a show. Just search Mr. Media Interviews from within iTunes and subscribe for free. You can also listen with a piece of string and a tin can in many locations. If you've got an idea for a guest, email me directly at bob@andelman.com. You can also follow me on Facebook or Twitter, www.twitter.com/Andelman. Thanks so much for joining us today. I always appreciate when you give up a piece of your day to share it with us. Let's go out today listening to the trailer again for Singing Revolution. Thanks for listening, everybody.
An extraordinary show of mass defiance in the Baltic region of the Soviet Union.
Whenever you give free speech to people, then things get out of hand.
This singing together, this was our power. If 20,000 people start to sing one song, then you just cannot shut them up. It's impossible.
What role can singing play when a nation is faced with annihilation by its neighbors? Can culture hold a people together? The small country of Estonia has faced these questions.
freedom through singing. It was the most important thing maybe in my life.
This is the story of how culture saved a nation.